Hi, this is a conversation with Riley Drake, and she's a researcher and Thiel Fellow. Riley, what would be the effect of having a crowd-based referee system in scientific research?
So in some ways, the referee system in scientific research is already crowd-based. We see with the review process, it's called a peer review process because researchers of similar capabilities and backgrounds review other researchers' work. This is somewhat crowd-based as the larger scientific community does evaluate scientific work. An entirely crowd-based system that doesn't account for credentials could be potentially dangerous. There's an interesting site that tried to do this, ResearchGate. ResearchGate is primarily useful because it has a lot of publications and a large community of researchers that log into it every week or so to print out their bibliography and add it to their CV of their publications. And one thing they tried to do was to allow anyone to ask a question, a scientific question, about whatever they wanted and have experts respond. As there were a lot of large expert community on ResearchGate, this made sense at the time. Unfortunately, what happened is the quality of the responses, the questions and answers, seems to have declined as it's been used primarily for homework help. And so while it seems cool as an educational tool, the lack of accreditation has caused a gradual decline in the quality of the information that goes back and forth on this website. And so I'm worried that if scientific research as a whole were to be crowd-refereed, that there would be maybe both false positive and false negatives, in which research that was legitimate and statistically sound and well performed might be called out as being illegitimate. And conversely, research that was illegitimate and perhaps a little bit hypey would be considered legitimate. And the sort of figuring out who necessarily should be evaluating research is a hard problem. It seems like the more people who evaluate research, the better responses we get, but it's also necessary and important to look at the credentials of the people who are evaluating that research.
Riley, what do you think about intellectual property in science research and in innovations?
Intellectual property is great as a driving force of scientific research. So as academics, we often have this feeling that we are getting at the truth of the matter. One phrase that I use a lot is that we as the human race are on a spaceship. It's called planet Earth, and we all live here, and we have limited resources. And we want to perpetuate our species, perhaps beyond the lifespan of this planet. And if you think of it like a practical problem, it's not that we're just getting at pure knowledge, even though pure knowledge is beautiful, but rather that we want to survive and continue our species and our race. And so in light of this, we should all be funding as much scientific research as possible. But this is something that we don't see. As a human species, we should be, this scientific research should be at the top of our minds. But we are rather money-focused for good reason. And so what we see, particularly in academic institutions, will develop IP, and then it will be licensed by other firms, companies. And so it becomes very valuable for researchers to be able to claim that that their research will lead to a reasonable innovation within a number of years. But it can also be a driving force backwards, in that if it becomes expected that pure scientific research will always lead to IP, then this can be a demotivating force for researchers who want to explore domains that won't directly relate to commercialization.
Riley, who are your heroes? What inspires you?
What originally inspired me many, many years ago in terms of getting into science was probably my dad. My dad was a clinical researcher, and he dealt with patients who had prostate cancer. And a couple times I went around with him on rounds and saw a number of men dying of prostate cancer. And this affected me. I was pretty young, but it didn't affect me as much as when I went on pediatric rounds. And it was so debasing to see kids my age who were dying of cancer and completely unable to affect their situations. And so this sort of incubated a while. And as growing up, I was very interested in animals, particularly rodents. And there's one story that I tell people sometimes in illustrating my persistence of rodents is I found some mice underneath of a bush, and I was really sad because they had been abandoned by their mother. And so I fed them protein shakes, and every 3 hours was what my dad said I had to do. So every 3 hours I would get up and feed them protein shakes from an eyedropper. And I did this for about 4 or 5 days, and unfortunately they died. And this was really upsetting. I was initially excited by the idea that a protein shake developed by science could save these mice, but then my utter inability to really understand the situation and what they needed must have led to them dying. And so that was maybe a formative experience for me. And then later, as I started working in a research lab, I had worked with mice, and doing mouse research means you have to kill them. It's called sacrifice. You say you sack mice, because sacking mice feels like you're sacrificing them to something greater, knowledge or the end of disease or something like that. But I was by hand, because it happens to be the most humane method, is to anesthetize a mouse and then break its neck. It's called cervical dislocation. But of course, as a 15-year-old, breaking several mice's necks by hand and then cutting the still warm bodies open was a little bit dissociative for me. I was like, okay, so this is science. And it was an interesting transition for me from the wanting to save everything to realizing that maybe in sacrificing for a greater good, we should kill these mice in the hopes that maybe the kids that I had seen on pediatric oncology rounds would someday be able to live.
Riley, most people would refer to you as an extraordinary person. Do you consider yourself extraordinary? And do you think that there should be a different kind of education for extraordinary people and for people who are not extraordinary?
Absolutely not. I don't think I'm extraordinary. The reason that I got into science was because I fell down the stairs. I was on the swim team. It's kind of a mundane story. I was on the swim team, and I was on several swim teams. I was captain of the swim team, and I was really tired after practice one night, going downstairs to the basement of my house to get a history book. Went a little bit too fast, fell down a flight of stairs. But this actually ended up changing the course of my life forever, as with 4 extra hours in the day from not going to swim practice, I ended up studying a lot of subjects I wouldn't have otherwise looked at, and I also ultimately ended up working in a research lab. And luckily for me, I had a lot of people who inherently trusted me to know what was best for me, and trusted me to pursue that actively. I think that people who are extraordinary come from small groups of support, people who trust them to do what is best. And so I don't think that we shouldn't separate the people who we consider extraordinary now and we consider not extraordinary, but in fact, in mixing these people together, we can have mutual inspiration and encouragement, such that the people who we don't consider extraordinary now can achieve their full potential in whatever field or cause they feel that they are led to.
Riley, thank you very much for sharing these experiences with us, and thank you too